score for us. While this event is hosted by the Davidson College Free Speech Alliance, it's made possible through the generous support of Davidsonians for Freedom of Thought and Discourse, and as well as Voices for Liberty. We're thankful for their support, and we look forward to continuing our relationship with them. The mission of the Davidson College Free Speech Alliance is to help ensure a learning environment at Davidson College that is ideologically balanced and that promotes lively and fearless freedom of debate and deliberation. As part of that mission, the Free Speech Alliance is committed to fostering civil discourse and promoting free speech in higher education. That's exactly what we're doing here today as we welcome Ms. Srossen and Governor Martin to Davidson's campus. Ms. Srossen is a professor emerita at New York Law School. She's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and she served as national president of the American Civil Liberties Union from 1991 to 2008. An internationally acclaimed free speech scholar and advocate, Ms. Srossen regularly addresses diverse audiences and provides media commentary around the world, all while serving on the advisory boards of several organizations that promote free speech and academic freedom. Among other things, Governor Martin is a Davidson College graduate, former Davidson College chemistry professor, 6-term U.S. congressman, and 2-term governor of North Carolina, the only Republican to be elected to multiple terms in the office of governor since before the Civil War. An internationally, he's also served as a trustee of Davidson College. He serves on the board of directors for Davidsonians of Freedom of Thought and Discourse, and he's the namesake of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal in Raleigh, North Carolina. We understand that many of us in the room may disagree or otherwise feel strongly about what Ms. Srossen and Governor Martin have to say, which is great. Constructive disagreement is a central element of our mission here today. However, if you'd like to voice your disagreement or otherwise have questions or comments, we ask that you please hold those until the end of the Q&A portion of the event. So with that in mind, and without further ado, please welcome Ms. Nadine Srossen and Governor James G. Martin to Davidson's campus.
While he brings down the microphone over, let me tell you, you can imagine how thrilled I am to be able to share this program with the 17-year president of the American Civil Liberties Union. Somewhat intimidating for a Republican, but I noticed in talking with her, she wasn't afraid of being on the stage with me either, so I think we're going to have some fun this evening. There will be some disagreements, and there'll be time for you to ask your questions, so think about it as we go along. We'll start out with about 40, 45 minutes or so of background material about free speech and a couple of particular issues, and then you can have time for yours. And so let's start with something that's a little easier with your, what we might call your elevator pitch in 20 stories or less, 20 floors or less, in favor of free speech. Is it really all that important?
Before I answered that question, Jim, and we agreed we would be on the same basis, since we're roughly contemporaries, I'd like to thank Barclay for the warm introduction, and to his organization and the other co-sponsoring organizations for the phenomenal work that you are doing to promote free speech, academic freedom, civil discourse. Davidson is really on the national map. It has been on my radar screen for a number of years as making really path-breaking innovations on these really important topics. And as a signal of my great respect for your great school, I'm wearing your school colors. Thank you for having very pretty colors. Okay, now for my elevator pitch for free speech. No matter who you are and no matter what you believe, you absolutely depend on robust freedom of speech for the most individual and personal reasons, that is to explore and develop and express your own sense of who you are, your identity, your beliefs, your opinions, but it's also essential for your relationships, including your most intimate relationships with family and friends, to communicate. It's also essential for our democratic republic, where we, the people, to quote the opening words of the Constitution, wield sovereign governmental power. How can we do that effectively unless we can engage in the most vigorous debate, discussion, and dialogue with each other and with those who are seeking to represent us and who have represented us, such as my esteemed co-panelists.
Now, the theme of free speech is written into the Constitution as part of the First Amendment. And one question falls from that: does that mean then that it's optional for private independent colleges and universities?
That is a very important point that most non-lawyers and even some lawyers do not know, that the First Amendment with its free speech guarantee only applies to the government. It literally says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. The Supreme Court has interpreted Congress as meaning all government officials and all branches and levels of government, including public universities, but it includes no private institutions, including no private sector universities. To the contrary, private universities have their own First Amendment rights, which can include the right to restrict certain speech on the part of faculty or students. But as you well know, Jim, the overwhelming majority of private higher educational institutions have voluntarily chosen to adopt essentially the same free speech and academic freedom protections they would be required to implement if they were public universities. They do this voluntarily because they believe it is consistent with the mission of the search for truth, academic freedom, and in the best pedagogical interest of their students and faculty.
Also, just in time, because some people are going to be testing whether, as with some other issues, the receipt of federal funds could be interpreted as Congress making laws.
So far, the United States Supreme Court has said that in a case that did involve a university that received more than 90% of its funding came from the government, and the Supreme Court said that was not enough to require it to adhere to the First Amendment. Some members of Congress are proposing legislation that would say now, for example, any higher education institution that receives federal funds has an accompanying statutory responsibility as a condition of the funding that they must not allow discrimination, including hostile environment, harassment on the basis of race, religion, and so forth. Some members of Congress are saying, well, we ought to amend that statute to add as another condition of federal funding that private educational institutions must protect strongly the free speech and academic freedom rights on their campus, but that hasn't passed yet.
In contemporary debate, we see that freedom of speech these days often seems to have become mostly a conservative talking point, while in the past it was on the other side. And one major breakthrough we've had here at Davidson College is that journalism professor Ike Bailey served as chair of a committee that I also served on that drafted Davidson's commitment to freedom of expression. And I don't think there's any time that I know of that Ike Bailey, my friend, would ever call himself a conservative. So it does show that it's not just for one side.
Oh,
a big difference.
As I said in my elevator pitch, regardless of who you are, regardless of what you believe, you absolutely depend on freedom of speech. And conversely, most of us do want to support restrictions for ideas that we consider dangerous. That tends to be a natural human tendency. Many of us in the free speech community are fond of saying that most people believe in freedom of speech for me, or people who agree with me, but not for thee. And the lesson that has to be taught, and it is a lesson that is born up from experience, is kind of the golden rule of free speech, that if you want to have freedom for the speech that you love, then you have to defend it for the speech that you loathe, because what you're defending is an underlying principle. And if I can put on my common law professor hat for 1 second here, of all the complicated First Amendment rules that the Supreme Court has developed over more than 100 years, the court has said unanimously for many, many decades now that the bedrock principle underlying all of that is what is usually called viewpoint neutrality or content neutrality. That government or universities, whoever the authorities are, may never restrict speech solely because of disagreement with, even loathing of the viewpoint, the idea, the message of the speech. If you disagree with that, then answer it back, refute it, repudiate it. Do not depend on government to censor it. And I assure you, given my perspective of traveling all over the country, that in some, no matter what your own ideas are, they may be very popular on your own campus or in your own community, but I guarantee you there are other communities, perhaps even in the very same state, where your viewpoints will be the ones that are controversial and rejected, and so they will depend on this viewpoint neutrality principle.
Nadine, this brings us to probably the toughest question about free speech. I would note that you're the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and some have thought it curious, maybe worse, that you have written a book on hatred. I believe it's called Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. Some would say hate speech is not free speech, but how is it protected then by the First Amendment or by the ideals that you have?
So I'm sorry I don't have a copy of the book with me because the cover is Davidson colors. It's red and black, and the title really summarizes the whole thesis. Hate, why we should resist it with free speech, not censorship. So note, the only verb in that title is resist. My overall message, and certainly my overall mission as a lifelong crusader for civil liberties and civil rights and human rights, is resisting hatred and discrimination and stereotyping. Certainly that's consistent with my own family history, as you allude to, Jim, but I cannot abide any kind of discrimination against any person, or based on who they are, or based on what they believe and what they say. But history has shown repeatedly around the world to the current day that no matter how well intended anti-hate speech laws are, they are at best ineffective and at worst counterproductive in reducing hatred. Think about it. We're trying to combat discriminatory attitudes and discriminatory actions. Going against expression is simply the most superficial manifestation of the underlying ideas. And what we've seen, including in Germany leading up to Hitler's rise to power, Germany had really strict anti-hate speech laws that were very strictly enforced, including against the Nazis themselves, who were repeatedly prosecuted and incarcerated. Hitler himself was banned from public speaking for 2 years in major parts of Germany. Tragically, we know that suppressing that speech did not suppress the ideas, did not avert the violence. And in fact, the historians' consensus is that the Nazis welcomed the prosecutions because it garnered for them attention that they otherwise would never have received and sympathy that they otherwise would never have received. The problem was that they literally got away with murder. They were not being prosecuted or punished for committing actual physical assaults and violence against Jews, against their political opponents, against others. It would have been as if during the civil rights movement in this country, we made no attempt to punish those who were attacking civil rights demonstrators. And by the way, if I may say so, Jim, one of the really striking aspects of the civil rights movement, as well as the movement for the abolition of slavery, every movement for social justice and human rights throughout our history has depended on robust free speech that is protective enough that it extends to ideas that are considered to be hateful and dangerous. I mean, from today's perspective, it's hard to imagine. But the pro-civil rights, anti-Jim Crow expression was what was seen as hateful and dangerous. Most people know that Martin Luther King wrote a famous letter from a Birmingham jail, but how many people know what he was in jail for? Most people don't.
Yes, speech.
He was imprisoned for what we would now consider to be the most core free speech, namely the right of citizens to protest what they believe to be unjust, unconstitutional government policies. But until the middle of the 20th century, the United States Supreme Court had not actually enforced our First Amendment free speech guarantee, and no coincidence, it was precisely in the context of the civil rights movement that we saw case after landmark case protecting free speech, which redounded to the benefit not only of all of us who are seeking to speak, but of the civil rights movement in particular. Congressman John Lewis, a great civil rights leader, famously said, for example, without freedom of speech, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings.
All that from the book that she wrote, there's a lot in there, and you can tell you would have bought a copy if you brought several here for the evening. Well, thank you. I'm sure I felt comfortable mentioning your family ancestry because that means that nobody can say that you don't understand.
I think that's right, and if I can give an example that's even more dramatic than my own, the ACLU, which was mentioned in the introduction, I was proud to had it for almost 18 years, but who's counting?
My subtraction was off, I'm just a chemist.
Our most famous, or depending on your perspective, infamous case throughout our more than 100-year history, and it's really a paradigmatic case that captures this central concept of viewpoint neutrality. The ACLU, which is on the forefront of fighting against discrimination and could not have views that are more antithetical to Nazis, in 1977 and 1978 came to the defense of the free speech rights of a group of neo-Nazis to demonstrate in Skokie, Illinois. Most people know this as the Skokie case. Skokie is a city near Chicago that has a large Jewish population, and at that time, the late 1970s, a large percentage of Skokie residents were actually Holocaust survivors. And of course, the ACLU deplored what their message was, but was supporting the underlying principle of viewpoint neutrality. It was a very controversial position, not in the courts. I mean, we easily won that case in the courts of law, including in the United States Supreme Court, where it was seen as such an easy legal issue that the court did something which is extremely rare. It ruled in favor of the First Amendment claim without receiving any legal briefs or without hearing any oral arguments. But easy a case as it was in the courts of law, it was very controversial in the courts of public opinion, including among ACLU members themselves. People who are such diehard free speech supporters that they forked over their $20 of dues, and by the way, still only $20, yes, that is an ad. And even, so it goes back to point I made earlier, even 15% of ACLU members resigned, saying we really believe in free speech, but this goes too far. Anyway, the national executive director of the ACLU at the time was a man named Aryeh Nair, who was himself a Holocaust survivor. He had been born in the Weimar Republic. His extended family was completely slaughtered by the Nazis. His immediate family survived after enormous suffering came to the United States. And after that case, Aryeh wrote a book, which is still one of the great classics of free speech, called Defending My Enemy and the Risks of Freedom. And I can't do justice with a paraphrase, but he basically gives such a powerful case that it is precisely Jews and members of other minorities who most strongly depend on freedom of speech, including freedom to express ideas that other people will see as hateful, because by definition, a minority group is never going to have access to the majoritarian power structures of government or social institutions. And so we are the ones who depend on the individual freedom of speech and assembly and petition.
Now, there are some people who would say that the First Amendment raises or privileges free speech as being more important than other constitutional equality rights. I'm not sure I understand that, but would appreciate hearing a little bit about it. It seems like maybe this is part of the discussion that says that, like a lot of other things, it's a tool for oppression, free speech. That it's a tool for the powerful rather than the powerless. If it's different from that, you can clarify.
Yes, as I just alluded to, it is precisely those who lack political power in the sense of being a majority of a certain constituency or community who are the ones who depend on individual rights, including the right to advocate, to try to persuade those who do wield majority power to protect their rights, to come to their aid. And in fact, throughout American history, we see that every single movement for increasing human rights, for protecting the disenfranchised, the marginalized, has always depended on free speech. And conversely, censorship has been a major tool that has been used in an effort to try to repress the movement. I gave a couple examples from the civil rights movement. Let me go back earlier to the movement to abolish slavery. Frederick Douglass, most people know, was born into slavery in 1818, escaped in 1838, was self-educated to a remarkable degree. He's really an outstanding and respected political philosopher. He became one of the most eloquent advocates and orators against slavery, not only all over this country, but in Europe as well. And back in 1860, he said, slavery cannot abide free speech. 5 years of the exercise of free speech would abolish the auction block and break every chain in the South. And think about that. Conversely, he and other pro-abolition speakers were subject to the same kind of mobbing and deplatforming from those who oppose their views that unfortunately we see too much of on many college campuses today. So I think that's always a really important example that when Frederick Douglass was trying to give a speech to an abolitionist meeting in Boston in 1860, so we're not talking about the Deep South. I know these are problems that are nationwide. We Yankees are guilty as well. And in Boston, a mob that was hostile to the abolition movement physically broke up and disrupted the meeting from going forward. Local law enforcement and government officials did not protect the speakers, so the whole proceeding was disbanded. But a couple days later, Douglas gave a speech elsewhere in Boston in which, to the best of my knowledge, he is the first person that pointed out something that the Supreme Court subsequently ruled on when he said that freedom of speech is the right not only of a speaker to convey ideas and information, but also the right of the audience members to hear the ideas and information, so that for mob violence or deplatforming to disrupt a proceeding is a double wrong, violating the audience's rights as well as the speaker's rights.
Several of the points that you made are tied to the reason why the Davidson commitment to freedom of expression connects those dozen or so principles from the Chicago statement to Davidson's own commitment for respect for minorities of whatever, including Republicans. It is broad-based in that language. It doesn't mention Republicans or any other group, but it does mention political views, minority views. But show you also, and I would say to those of you who know my friend Ike Bailey, please tell him that I bragged about him and his work on that. He helped me get all of those provisions from Chicago into the statement. Another bipartisan illustration is how it seems these days that both the liberals and conservatives are looking for ways to silence each other by censoring books and social media platforms. In Florida, for example, it's about whether the state can limit the availability of controversial books for impressionable children or even for college. And some of y'all are still impressionable. I know you feel that way sometimes. But earlier this week, on another topic, the Supreme Court began hearing arguments on whether the government had crossed the line, so to speak, the constitutional line, into censorship of lawful speech when it was alleged to have pressured social media platforms to take down content that it deemed misleading, either the government or the platform. And that case poses a significant test of the First Amendment's free speech expressions and protections in this digital age. It's going to be very interesting to see how it turns out, perhaps depending on whether they find a way to sidestep it if the platform took it as state advice rather than regulation. But do you have any prediction about that, or hope for the best?
I'm not optimistic for what I think should be the correct outcome based on how the Supreme Court opinion or argument went. But if I can give a little bit of background on that, Jim, it's such an important issue. Thank you for raising it. So, as we discussed earlier, the social media companies as private sector entities have no direct First Amendment obligation to respect the rights of anybody. So they, and conversely, especially as communications platforms, they have their own First Amendment rights to make editorial decisions about which speakers and ideas they do want to host and which ones they don't want to host, just the way Fox TV or MSNBC or the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal doesn't have to host every particular perspective and every particular speaker. However, let me make one other preliminary point. Government officials have First Amendment free speech rights to try to persuade private sector actors, including social media platforms, not to air certain perspectives, not to host certain views. And one can even say that it's their responsibility in terms of protecting national security and public health, that if they think something that is going to be on those platforms might be dangerous to the public interest to try to persuade. Sometimes the term jawboning is used. I'm sure that's familiar to you from your distinguished political career, to try to persuade these companies to take...
Old Testament term.
Okay, and constitutional and Old Testament, great sources.
The jawbone for that.
Yeah. But the distinction is that government officials may try to persuade or encourage or urge the platforms to deplatform some ideas or expression or speakers, but they may not coerce in practical effect. It puts so much pressure on these platforms that as a practical matter, they are being forced by the government to take down certain speakers, because that is the government, in fact, doing an end run around its own First Amendment responsibilities. All the speech that we're talking about, by the way, the government would not have the power directly to censor. It is all constitutionally protected speech. So the court has to police that line between permissible government encouragement and impermissible government coercion. And unfortunately, from the questions of the justices, they seemed extremely deferential toward the government. I think a little bit too credulous that government officials were acting in pursuit of the public interest. We can see a pattern that those who were pressured to be deplatformed were any speakers, including scientists and doctors with very respectable credentials, who had opinions that were different from or questioning of or critical of official government policy about matters related to COVID. And I think the danger of government, overstepping its line and pressuring for deplatforming is a danger not only to free speech, but also to public health. I mean, the whole scientific method depends on having every idea, no matter how strongly particular scientists may believe it, no matter how much evidence is there for it, to be subject to questioning and debate. Oh, and Jim, I told you I had a favorite prop that I want to be able to use. This is a good opportunity.
You didn't tell me what.
I didn't. It's a surprise. You can maybe.
Is it a MAGA hat?
You can maybe guess that that's what it is, but what does it actually say?
I can't see the middle part.
Could I get it?
Make John Stuart Mill great
Yes,
again.
make John Stuart Mill great again. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Mill's philosophy, but he wrote one of the great defenses of free speech. I reread it every few years, and it really stands the test of time, called On Liberty in 1859. Let me also say, since it's Women's History Month, there is a lot of evidence now that it was co-authored by his wife, Harriet Taylor, including algorithmic evidence that has analyzed language patterns. But anyway, so in On Liberty, they make the argument that even, indeed, especially the ideas that we most cherish, most deeply believe, must be subject to re-examination, to questioning, to criticism. That is essentially the scientific method as well, right? Because even if we, first of all, we may find out that on re-examination that our ideas are wrong. So it's a contribution to truth to allow the re-examination. But even if we end up upon re-examination reaffirming our pre-existing idea, that's still a benefit because we will understand it more deeply. We will be able to persuade other people of it more effectively than if we're just routinely repeating it as a dead dogma. And so I'm really concerned that of the implications of this case for public health and every other public interest, as well as free speech.
This one might be more, it's a short question, maybe more like an elevator question. What we read about colleges that have been evaluating candidates for faculty, perhaps even for students, let's say for hiring and promotion, based on how committed they stated to be, they claim to be toward diversity, equality, and inclusion. And on the one hand, you could say, well, they're entitled to free speech too, to uphold the standards of the college. But also you could argue that, well, that's requiring conformity of thought in trying to protect students from hearing other ideas, or at least from hearing them from somebody that really believes them. What do you say about that?
You know, to use
Maybe that's not a short elevator.
I'm sorry, the question may be short, the answer isn't, for this reason, that the devil is in the details, right? So if there were truly an open-ended question, to my mind, to be really open-ended, what is your concept of diversity, equality, or equity and inclusion? And what do you think are the pros and cons of various ways of pursuing, truly open-ended and making it clear that this is just a subject for an essay, and it's going to be evaluated in terms of the persuasiveness of your reasoning, the clarity of your analysis, the articulateness with which you convey your ideas. In other words, viewpoint neutral evaluation. As opposed to if the signal is very clearly that this is fishing for you to at least pay lip service to a preferred, what you suspect to be the preferred orthodox view on that campus of those issues, that would be the opposite. That would be discriminating on the basis of viewpoint. And unfortunately, many DEI programs, no matter how well intended they might be, and no matter how laudable those goals are in the abstract, have really become litmus tests for a very narrow ideological view on matters of identity politics, and usually don't extend to the important kind of diversity that you referred to, Jim, that is crucial in a university, and especially crucial in a university, and that is diversity of ideas, diversity of belief. And I think we have, just a dominant orthodoxy on so many campuses in terms of political perspectives and religious, or should I say, irreligious perspectives.
Well, we have had an interesting conversation between the two of us. I've got a couple more that I'll hold in case y'all run out of things to say, but if we have people who will hand out microphones and be able to offer one to you as you came up, I would point out that in 1925, ACLU really got a start with over in Dayton, Tennessee, with the famous monkey trial. First time a trial has ever been broadcast on the radio in Chicago, not in Tennessee. But it was the Scopes trial. John Thomas Scopes, a physics professor, agreed to stand trial because while substituting one day, he happened to mention to the biology students, he was physics coach, but he mentioned to the biology students that you might want to look at the back of your textbook. There's this chapter about evolution. And the state had just passed a law banning that, teaching of it, and the ACLU was trying to look for a test case. Well, the only problem was he was guilty. He did get, because he violated the law. But they had Clarence Darrow for the defense against William Jennings Bryan, three-time Democratic nominee for president of the United States. Quite a great thing that happened over there. There's even a Bryan College there now named for the winner on the side. It never got to the Supreme Court. that particular case because it got thrown out on a technicality. The judge had forgotten that while the new law required a $100 fine, the state constitution required a jury trial to have any fine more than $50. And so they overthrew the decision and sent the word out, please don't bring this one back up again. But of course, it did a lot of damage in its day.
Well, it was.
Later got addressed by different cases.
Yes, exactly. The ACLU finally got anti-evolution teaching of laws that criminalize the teaching of evolution were finally struck down in 1968. I know to the young people here that also seems like ancient history. That was the year I graduated from high school.
Remember Bill Clinton had one of the cases as governor of Arkansas, and because the court ruled that it was unconstitutional, he couldn't challenge it. He agreed with the decision, and it was later in Louisiana where a similar case was taken up, and there the governor, who was notorious in a lot of ways, did challenge it, and it was able to get to the Supreme Court and held to be unconstitutional, violation of the First Amendment provision. Now, someone have a question?
I've got a microphone.
Well, this is your opportunity. One of all time.
You know, I'm a law professor, and that means I can call on you and ask you a question. You know that, right? Especially those of you in the front row.
Thank you both. This was really wonderful. I'm wondering, at private institutions with their own free speech statements like Davidson, what can students and individual faculty members who may not have influence over ensuring these policies are enforced do to ensure they're upheld and that an ideal intellectual discourse is maintained so that the institutions can meet their goals?
It's a fantastic question. And it's something that I discussed at great length with a group of students here earlier today, because it is one thing, and it's certainly necessary to have as a prerequisite for meaningfully enjoying free speech and academic freedom. We need those policies. So thanks to you and others, Jim, for being sure that there are excellent free speech policies here. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Think of the First Amendment itself. It was adopted in 1791. For the majority of the history, it might as well not have existed at all. I told you about Martin Luther King being in jail for exercising what we now understand to be First Amendment rights. So, and that's why the ACLU was founded, that's why the NAACP and other organizations were founded, to take what James Madison, principal author of the First Amendment, called parchment barriers to government violations, to turn them into real rights. So you're basically asking me, how do we do that with our policies here? And you do it, you have a lot of opportunity, every single individual student, faculty member, staff member, other member of this community, by every opportunity demanding or requesting that there be information about what the policies are. I don't know how widely disseminated they are. That there be instruction about what they actually mean. Training in how to enforce and honor them in every context. I would say training that is as serious and as rigorous and thorough as most educational institutions do with respect to sexual harassment and other aspects of the DEI goals. And I would even start earlier than that in the recruitment materials. You know, that when students are invited to apply here, or faculty members to apply, that they are advised that this is a campus that takes these principles very seriously. So if you believe in subjecting your own ideas to rigorous examination and to being confronted with ideas and expressions that you might find challenging or even worse, offensive, if that bothers you, don't come here. But if you see that as the wonderful educational opportunity that we at Davidson believe it to be, then we welcome you here. And that the orientation program should include instruction. One of the best orientation programs that I've seen was done at Purdue University under the leadership of Midge Daniels, who was a terrific president there. And groups of students actually volunteered to construct and enact skits that represented very typical situations that arise on campus of unpleasant speech or attempts to suppress speech, and they enacted how that should be responded to. So, you know, you kind of have a three-dimensionality to it.
Ike Bailey and I are also pushing for consideration of introducing that into freshman orientation here and having an annual symposium on the subject of free speech. And there's another example of our answer to your question that was in the Davidsonian about a week ago, Above the Fold, an article that talked about two issues that have been raised here on campus that both were brought by students to a group of alumni that I'm a part of, the Davidsonians for Freedom of Thought and Discourse, which has no official standing except that we are trying to help to broaden the discussion here on campus as best we can. And I guess they had confidence to bring to us their concern, first about some courses that had syllabi that most people weren't aware of, but looking at what the course is going to be about, found things that disturbed him. And so we called that to the attention of the administration and are waiting for that to be addressed by the faculty. We have a petition for other alumni to help show that there's more strength for that issue. We're not saying that we have authority by any means to determine what the policy of the college will be. Again, we're unauthorized. We're not even an official ombudsman, you might say. But while that was in process, this had to do with whether you are among the oppressed victims of society. If not, you're one of the oppressors, depending on how much melanin or in your skin or whatever it might be, what your particular orientations are for different reasons. And we just felt that was not suitable in a course where it was not part of the subject matter. And the American Association of University Professors has not only protected academic freedom since 1940, the same length of time has said, but the teacher must not introduce into the course and emphasize persistently material that is not relevant to the subject matter of the course. And of course, while that was stirring up, we found out about the mandate for all of the athletes to go to the film, the documentary called I'm Not Racist, Am I? And of course, the answer to that was that film was, I think, very prejudicial in a way that it only allowed one point of view. Well, we think that is out of place, and we're not going to be able to control it, but we're asking the faculty and the trustees to pay attention to it. So, if you have an issue that comes up that you're interested in, you have to judge whether you think that same organization can fairly handle your case. Or you can go to a lawyer.
On the issue of indoctrination in class, something very simple but I think very important would be for every faculty member to stress at every opportunity, including on the syllabus, on exams and in class discussion, that you are not going to be graded on the basis of your viewpoint. Kind of the point that I made earlier, you will be evaluated on how well you reason in support of it, how persuasive the authorities are that you cite, how articulate your explanation is, but not on whether I personally agree or disagree with it.
Yeah, the teachers have, and if that had been done, maybe it never would have come up. But the teachers are entitled to their views too. And the question is whether their training in chemistry, for example, in my case, whether that qualifies me with credentials to handle what a psychologist might be better able to deal with in some of the issues that your generation is confronting, or even to put any pressure on students about political issues. I was the I was the faculty advisor for the College Republicans and also for something called the Conservative Club, because I couldn't find anybody else even back then. Back then most Southerners were Democrats, even most conservatives were Democrats. But I would not dare try to sell a political view in a chemistry class. We had too much that needed to be covered.
Yes, another question here.
So Governor Martin, you alluded to it, but Dr. Srossen, I wanted to ask you regarding the movie. I'm not sure how much you're aware with everything what happened, but basically student athletes were mandated to go and watch this movie. And the common consensus, I play football. We're the most racially diverse team on campus by far, and it's not close. And far and away, the common consensus was that the movie caused much more harm than good. I wanted to get your perspective as an advocate of free speech, as a representative of ACLU, how you guys would handle that kind of situation, or what your opinion would be. Not necessarily your personal perspective, but where would that kind of fall on the free speech continuum? Do you view that as a violation, or obviously being that this is a private institution, is that kind of in line with what they're allowed to do?
As I said earlier, private institutions can be bound by free speech principles, as this one is, by having adopted the Chicago free speech principles. That said, the academic freedom rights of particular faculty members, or I guess in this case it would have been the coach of the team, the athletic department, has autonomy in making their best judgment in selecting materials for their students to view, or in this case for their teams to view. And just the way a faculty member can decide what books to include on the syllabus, or the department can decide what courses to include in the curriculum. So they probably have the right to do that. But there's another question, which is it right to do that? Is it pedagogically justified? Is it justified in terms of the spirit of diversity of ideas we're trying to encourage? And very significantly, is it justified in terms of promoting racial understanding and mutual respect? Here again, I'm not familiar with a particular film, but there have been meta-studies of training materials that are used for DEI programs, anti-racism programs, on both campuses and in corporations. And tragically, the meta-studies show that these materials actually end up increasing people's discomfort and hostility and undermining racial and other intergroup harmony. So I can't comment on the particular film, but I would say, no matter how positive, and the goals of DEI are positive, but that doesn't mean that anything that is touted under that banner is necessarily going to be positive. And at the very least, nothing should be presented on a campus, including in this context, that is not, even if the faculty member or the athletic department exercises academic freedom and making a choice, this is the film we want our student athletes to see, they still must allow every student to question, to challenge, to debate, to dispute. They may not require you to, profess adherence to the particular perspective that is being purveyed by any material that is presented, including, by the way, this lecture, right? The First Amendment and the free speech principles that have been adopted here prohibit what is called compelled speech. And the Supreme Court has said, going way, way back, one of the earliest pro-free speech decisions that it issued, the court said it is even more of a violation of individual dignity and autonomy and freedom for the government to compel you to say something or to profess belief in something that goes against your beliefs, that is even more violative of our rights than being stopped from saying something we do believe.
Nadine, one of the points I would make, and that the Davidsonian freedom of thought and discourse made, was that we were not interested in any criticism of individuals. When we went public with these two concerns that we had, we redacted all of the names of anybody who might have been criticized by anything that we were reporting. And of course, some people, instead of saying that what we were reporting were problems, they said we were the problem, being the messenger. But I can get you a clip of this particular film that you'll understand why nobody on campus defends its thesis. Its thesis is that racism is synonymous with white. And after just getting through Black History Month and celebrating the Martin Luther King speech, I have a dream that one day my 4 children will be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. This documentary took a whole year of badgering a group of 12 high school students till they finally accepted with tears the shame of each other. That's not education. There was nobody in the discussion that followed. It was all led by one of the producers. That's the only way you can get to see that film in its entirety. You've got to bring them in to run the discussion. Am I right about that? There was no coach there at the end because they weren't invited.
I think one of the reasons why, so let me start with...
So just to let you know, there's some complexity there, and we don't know how it's going to turn out, but I would expect that's not going to happen again.
Surveys consistently show that on campuses across the country, faculty members and students there are a number of really important subjects where people feel that they cannot have a frank and candid conversation. And these tend to be the subjects that are the most important because they are at the center of political and cultural controversies. And one is anything to do with race, another is anything to do with gender. Abortion is a topic that almost 50% of college students are saying they cannot have a frank and candid conversation on their campus. Yeah. Gun rights, another big controversial topic. And sadly, I think people are afraid that if they dare to criticize a particular film that is portrayed as being an anti-racist film, well, if you criticize that, that means that you're a racist. And I think one of the positive developments in my lifetime is like one of the worst things that you can call somebody, one of the worst insults, is to say you're a racist, right? Or you're a sexist. To me, as a human rights advocate, that's positive. That we all think that's like the worst thing that you can be. But we cannot really make progress on these issues unless we can have candid discussions about what is racism, what is the most effective way to reduce it.
Hey.
Hi.
Is that right?
Yes.
Hey, I've been bragging on you, man.
Hey,
I've heard so much about you. Nice to meet you in person.
you too. Thank you very much. at least like, actually when it comes to sort of like free speech, like in terms of sort of that, yeah, it's like that. Like that's sort of like is like really, really easy part, right? Whereas like in terms of that, like we all like want that. That's really easy. And yet, also, like, actually, when it comes to the detail in terms of that, like that is the issue. And so, sort of,
I think part of what you're saying is that the devil is in the details, right? We can agree on free speech in the abstract.
it's like one second.
Yeah.
And so, like for me, in terms of that, like I sort of like actually stutter, for instance, right? And so, like for me, in terms of that, like my sort of like challenge, like is like always just speaking at all, right? And so, like for me, in terms of that, like I am always sort of we have like in terms of that, at least sort of like like at least sort of at least sort of at least like sort of in terms of that, like I am always sort of like very I sort of always struggle, right? And yet, though, so like in this case right here, in terms of that, at least to sort of like actually here, so like Governor Martin told actually sort of actually talk about the film, for instance. But in terms of that, like I think that like was not accurate at all, right? Yeah. Yes, like and. Yes, like and also in terms of that, like I sort of actually spoke at least with sort of at least with sort of like dozens at least sort of like scholar athletes. And so like what I found was this, like in terms of sort of that, like after the film, yes, in terms of that, like everybody sort of it's like she could speak about the film, right? Like one, and also the fact that in terms of that, like what has happened here, though, yes, in terms of that, yes, like in terms of that, like is a sort of like 5-minute clip, you know, yes, in terms of that, like wasn't actually sort of actually taken out of context, like actually just spread all around, and like actually just said, yes, like in terms of that, like Davidson, like is like actually trying to, he's like actually like force sort of like one view on students. Yes, like. And like again, in terms of that, like that is absolutely inaccurate. Whereas like, and also the fact, just in terms of that, whereas like, and also the fact, just in terms of that, like actually when it comes to at least to sort of like free speech, like in terms of that, like it is okay for people to be like uncomfortable. It is absolutely okay for people at least to like actually be challenged. And yet, though, sort of like one of our struggles here. Yes, in terms of that, like, is this whole idea in terms of sort of that, like, our sort of like rhetoric like it's about free speech. It's like actually being used, like in order to actually push back, like on sort of these sort of like these sort of these sort of actually when it comes to sort of like DEI, etc. And like lastly, in terms of that, like what, and so like for me, in terms of that, I sort of actually have been trying to build yes, like in terms of sort of like support for like more sort of that free speech on campus. Yes, like for sure. And yet though, and yet though sort of and yet though sort of at least like when it comes to a like, massive barrier. But yes, like in terms of sort of like on that, it's sort of like this sort of like idea, like which is sort of actually saying, like essentially, yes, in terms of that, like actually when it comes to sort of like white students like who happen to be conservative, but yes, in terms of sort of that, like they sort of like actually should not be discomforted. Yes, again, in terms of that, like I sort of actually have been like actually, yes, in terms of that, like I sort of like actually, at least like actually at least like actually for like the past 3 years, like, in terms of that, like, I sort of actually have been sort of actually trying to sort of like actually beat back that rhetoric. Yes, and also together in terms of that, like it has been really, 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 really difficult. At least like actually get like real sort of coalitions like built. We yes, like in terms of sort of that, and because sort of yes, in terms of sort of that, like actually because of like these kinds of sort of like programs, like which sort of actually pits. Yes, like in terms of sort of yes, in terms of that, like they sort of like actually pit. Yes, like in terms of sort of like free speech, like and sort of like diversity, like these sort of like against each other. And so like for me, like in terms of that, and so like essentially, there's yes, in terms of that, like as long as that keeps happening, because in terms of that, like it is going to be that much more difficult. Like these sort of actually build like more sort of like coalitions, and like that is my sort of like that is my major frustration.
Yeah. Well,
Yes,
thank you so much, Ike, if we can be on a first name basis. Those are very important comments, and of course everybody can and should interpret, the particular film for themselves, and you have no right not to be made uncomfortable, no matter what your perspective is. That, to the contrary, Bill and Taylor would say, you have an obligation. We faculty members have an obligation to make students uncomfortable. But I would come back to, that is to challenge their preconceptions. But I would come back to this notion of the devil is in the details, and it depends on how it is presented. So everything can be taught in an inappropriately indoctrinating manner. I could try to teach the First Amendment in an indoctrinating manner. I don't. My students don't pass, let alone get a good grade, they don't even pass unless they are able to articulate and advocate all plausible perspectives on all issues. Not only the pro-free speech arguments, but the anti-free speech arguments. So no matter what the particular contents of this film were, if it was presented as a launch pad for discussion, where everybody feels equally comfortable saying things that make everybody else equally uncomfortable, as long as it is done in a spirit of genuine, open inquiry and open listening as well as speaking, because listening is a big part of what we're talking about here, then it would be positive. And
I want to pay tribute to my good friend for being here to present his views to us. As I said before, and should emphasize, one of the things I'm particularly proud is that he does not require his students to agree with him. He gets them to take other sides in order to learn about the opposing view, and that's good pedagogy, I think. He and I have become friends because in recent months we've sort of been dueling editorial writers for the Charlotte Observer on a couple of topics, and I think I've written a couple of editorials that he really likes, but I won't. That has to be what you might call part of the no Trump Republican group up here. But thank you.
You're a John
appreciate
Stuart
you
Bill
being-
Republican.
So, sorry, backing out of like the academia space that we've been talking about, one thing that y'all touched on but didn't really touch on was the opposition sometimes of free speech and separation of church and state, and how those two rights can kind of talk themselves in circles, particularly when government officials speak freely about their religion, and kind of when that impedes upon government and when it retracts from free speech, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it's a very important question, and again, I'll use a phrase that is very important in the law. It's a delicate balance. Government has to do its best, including the Supreme Court has to do its best to maximally protect all of the constitutional rights, including all of the ones in the First Amendment, and sometimes they are in tension with each other. So as I said earlier, government officials have free speech rights. They certainly have religious liberty rights. And this is analogous to what I said about government putting pressure on social media. It's one thing for a government official simply to be expressing his or her own viewpoint, including a religious viewpoint. But if they cross the line and are putting pressure on other people, exercising their power and their influence to try to pressure those people to adopt the same religious views, that is unconstitutional. So the clearest example would be let's say a grade school teacher who is a public official certainly has the right to exercise her own religious liberty, to express her religious viewpoint, but should not do it in the classroom in a way that, here's the term the Supreme Court uses, that seems to be putting the imprimatur or the seal of approval of government upon a particular religious belief, because that makes other students who don't share that belief feel as if they are not equal members of that community unless they also adopt it. So those are the principles, and, you know, the different justices and individuals may disagree about how you work them out in a particular situation.
And for what it's worth, the First Amendment does not say anything about separation of church and state. That was a Jeffersonian phrase that did not win enough friends to get it into the Constitution. What it does say is that Congress and now government generally shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And so a member of Congress or a regulator or anyone can act on moral and ethical principles that derive from their religious faith, and there's nothing in the Constitution that says they can't. It just says that you can't impose that in a way that establishes a state religion, and that's interpreted broadly with regard to decorations around holiday times and so forth, or prohibiting those who wish to exercise their religious freedom. You can't have anything to interfere with that. Did I get that pretty close, Professor?
Yes. And, you know, it's interesting that Thomas Jefferson famously created this metaphor of the wall separating church and state. But 150 years earlier, Roger Williams, who was the founder of the Baptist church in this country, used exactly the same metaphor. He talked about a hedge between the garden of religion and the wilderness of secular society. And he said it was for the benefit of preserving the purity and sanctity of religion against the corrupting influence of the state, that hedge had to be maintained. And I think that's really important, because a lot of people assume that enforcing the non-establishment clause is somehow hostile to religion, and yet it has been some of our most religious leaders, including our most religious Supreme Court justices, who have been most adamant that it is for the sake of religion as well as secular society that those boundaries be protected.
One problem back then was that about half of these new states, since colonial days, had their own established religion in the state, and they would not have approved anything that forbid having an established religion. That's why it's worded, shall make no law respecting. And it's only later with other amendments and with decisions of courts that I guess felt they knew better than those who wrote the First Amendment, that it got to where it is today. But the Establishment Clause, or the Disestablishment Clause, and the Free Exercise Clause have many times conflicted. And it's interesting that the Supreme Court has ruled roughly half the time in favor of the Establishment Clause and half the time in favor of the Free Exercise Clause, which tells you they all bad. You know, the system's working pretty good because it makes everybody a little bit mad.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ms. Srossen, for joining us this evening, and thank you, Governor Martin, for facilitating this evening's event. I know that Ms. Srossen and the Governor are going to stick around for a few minutes afterwards. If you have any questions that you were not able to ask, we encourage you to do so after the conclusion of this evening's official portion of the event. We'd once again like to thank Davidsonians for Freedom of Thought and Discourse and Voices for Liberty for their sponsorship of this evening's event. If you're interested in learning more about the FTD, please feel free to speak with Kevin Cook over there when we're done here this evening. Also, if you're a Davidson student interested in learning more about the Davidson College Free Speech Alliance, or you'd like to become a member, please come see me after this. Stephen Walker, who serves as president of the College Republicans and is a fellow with the Deliberative Citizenship Initiative, is going to quickly tell us about 2 upcoming events, and then we'll all get you on your way this evening. I know we ran a little long, and I apologize for that, but thank you all for coming, and have a great evening.
Thank you, Barkley. And I'll make this quick and have people in places to be. Tomorrow, the College Republicans, in partnership with the FTD, it wouldn't have been able to happen without them, are hosting Congressman Greg Murphy for a speech and a question and answer session. So this will be in Hans Auditorium at 7:30. You'll have a chance to engage with a policy leader, a leading congressman who's influential right now in debates about DEI in medical schools. He hosts annual free speech roundtables. He's driving a lot of policy that directly affects all of our lives in significant ways. And even if you're not a Republican, we really want as much people as possible to show up. We love engaging in conversations with people we disagree with. We, the Davidson College Republicans, love uncomfortable conversations. So please support us. This is the only event in my time here at Davidson that has brought a major conservative speaker to campus outside of DFTD and FSA. So it's a very extraordinary experience, opportunity, and your support can show the school, show everyone that we want to have open, candid conversations, solve the problems facing the country, and to do it the Davidson way, to do it better than the polarized politicians that are pulling people apart and frankly not getting anything done. So that's tomorrow, 7:30, Hans Auditorium. I heard Governor Martin will actually be there, so we're excited for him. And also maybe Senator Tillis may be there, North Carolina Senator. So a lot of wonderful people to meet, 7:30, Hans Auditorium. And now taking off my Republican hat, putting on my DCI hat. Next week, Dr. Srossen mentioned one of the main things people don't talk about on college campuses is the gun debate. DCI, Dr. Bullock, and our whole crew have been working very hard to get a panel of speakers, the head of the African American Gun Association, a gun rights group, a Air Force veteran who is now the leader of her own local gun control group, and then two experts who are pro and anti-gun. So really elite activists and experts both for and against guns who will engage in a panel discussion moderated by Dr. Dan Aldridge, Professor of History and Chair of the Africana Studies Department. This is an extraordinary conversation and on another issue that affects all of our lives. It'll be April 2nd, 7 p.m. in the Lilly Gallery. You can sign up at deliberativeCitizenshipInitiative.org or go to the DCI's Instagram at Deliberative Citizenship Initiative. And after the panel, after they model the discussion on the issue, you will be able to engage in a panel with your peers in the audience, hosted by us, the fellows, who will moderate a discussion. So that'll be an exceptional opportunity. So that'll be April 2nd, 7 p.m. You have to sign up by tomorrow, March 28th. And these are both really incredible ideas to get campus discourse going, get us engaging in conversations that we need to have as the leaders of tomorrow to ensure that once we graduate, we're making good on Davidson's promise to engage in leadership through service, to leave this country better than we found it, than we've inherited it. So thank you to Barkley and the FSA for giving me the platform to plug both of these events. And I hope to see a lot of you there. Thank you so much.